Hello everyone, welcome to Love Wave's story. I never thought one word could freeze my whole body. We were in bed with the lights low, the kind of quiet that usually feels safe. I had my eyes closed and was breathing him in when he whispered a name into my ear, and it wasn't mine. I didn't react, not even a small movement or sound. I told myself maybe I imagined it or my brain filled in a gap that wasn't really there, so I smiled afterward, kissed his shoulder, went to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror like I was checking if I still existed. That name kept replaying in my head, clear, soft, intimate, said the way you only say someone's name when you feel close to them. When I got back into bed he was already asleep, peaceful and untouched by the chaos he dropped inside me, and I lay there counting the cracks in the ceiling, wondering how long a second can last when it changes everything. The next morning I tested him casually and said he was talking in his sleep last night. He laughed too fast and said yeah, he does that sometimes, and I almost asked the question right then, but something stopped me, a feeling deep in my gut telling me that if I asked I wouldn't like the answer, and once I knew it I couldn't unknow it. So I stayed quiet, but silence has a way of getting loud later. Over the next few days I started noticing things I swear weren't there before, the way he froze when his phone lit up, how he suddenly cared about locking it, how one song on the radio made him change the station immediately, and that name started showing up everywhere, on a coffee shop receipt, on a work email CC'd by mistake, on a street sign we passed without him saying a word. I never believed in signs before, but now I couldn't stop seeing them, and the scariest part was realizing I might be living in someone else's unfinished story. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid because married women do that. We connect dots that aren't there because we're scared of losing what we built, so I decided to act normal, maybe even too normal, cooking his favorite dinners, laughing at his jokes even when they weren't funny, reaching for his hand in public just to feel if it still felt like mine. But something was off, and every time I touched him it felt like I was interrupting a thought, like he had to come back to me from somewhere else. One night while he was in the shower his phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I wasn't trying to snoop, I swear. I just wanted it to stop vibrating, but the notification preview flashed for half a second before the screen went dark and it said, "Are you sure she doesn't know?" with no name attached, just that. My heart started pounding so loud I was afraid he'd hear it through the water, and I put the phone back exactly where it was like it could accuse me if I didn't. At dinner I watched him differently, noticing how his fork paused in midair when I asked about his day and how he avoided my eyes when I mentioned work. And when I casually asked if he ever thought about people from his past he shrugged and said sometimes, asking why, and I just nodded, took a sip of wine, and felt my hands shaking so badly I had to hold the glass with both of them. That night when he reached for me I let him because I needed to know, I needed to feel if he was still with me in that moment or if I was just a body filling space, and when he closed his eyes I understood everything, because he wasn't alone in that bed, and neither was I. I barely slept that night. My body was exhausted but my mind kept replaying everything on a loop, the name, the message, the way his eyes drifted away from me like I wasn't the only one standing there, and by morning I felt empty but strangely calm, like something inside me had already accepted the truth before I was ready to say it out loud. I watched him get dressed for work, noticing details I had ignored for years, the new shirt I'd never seen before, the extra care he took with his hair, the way he checked his phone twice before putting it in his pocket. And I wondered who he was trying to look good for, because it didn't feel like it was me anymore. After he left, the house felt too quiet, not peaceful quiet but heavy, like the walls knew something I didn't want to admit, so I did the one thing I promised myself I wouldn't do, I opened his laptop. I already knew the password because we trusted each other once, and that realization hurt more than what I was about to find. I didn't dig through messages right away. Instead I froze when I saw a folder on the desktop with a name on it, that same name, the one that had been haunting me, sitting there like it belonged. Inside were old photos, not explicit, not secretive, just intimate in a way that felt worse, pictures of road trips, coffee cups on dashboards, her laughing at the camera like she knew the person behind it loved her. The timestamps made my stomach drop because some of them weren't that old, not old enough to be part of a closed chapter. And that's when I realized this wasn't about cheating in the usual way, this was about something unfinished, something he carried with him into our marriage, something he never let go of. I closed the laptop feeling like I had just walked into a room I was never meant to see, and instead of anger what I felt was humiliation, Because I suddenly understood that I wasn't competing with a woman in the present, I was competing with a memory he refused to bury. For the rest of the day I moved through the house like a ghost, doing normal things on autopilot while my chest felt tight and hollow at the same time, and the more I thought about it the clearer it became that confronting him right away would only give him time to lie better, so I decided to wait and watch, even though every part of me wanted to scream. When he came home that evening I studied his face like a stranger's, noticing how relaxed he seemed, how easily he smiled at me, and I wondered how long he'd been practicing that version of himself. Over dinner he talked about work, deadlines, traffic, all the boring details of a normal life, and I kept nodding while thinking about the woman in those photos, the one who knew him before me, the one he still carried quietly. At one point he mentioned an old college friend by name and my heart jumped, but it wasn't her, and I hated myself for the relief I felt. Later that night I asked him something small, something harmless, whether he'd ever thought about reaching out to people he'd lost touch with. And for a split second his jaw tightened before he smiled and said not really, the past was the past. That tiny moment told me everything, because his body reacted before his words could catch up. When we went to bed he wrapped his arm around me like always, but instead of comfort it felt like pressure, like I was being held in place while his mind went somewhere else, and I lay there staring into the dark, realizing that the worst part wasn't the other woman, it was the fact that he was sharing our bed with a secret, and I was the only one who didn't get a choice. The next morning I woke up with a plan I didn't remember making. It was just there, heavy and clear, and it told me not to confront him yet but to understand the shape of the lie first. While he was in the shower, I checked his calendar on the fridge, something I'd never cared about before, and that's when I noticed it, a recurring block every other Thursday evening labeled gym, always the same time, always too long, always ending later than it should. I'd never questioned it because he came home tired and sweaty, but now even that detail felt rehearsed. That afternoon I drove past his gym without really thinking I would do it, telling myself I was just curious, and when I saw the lights off and the parking lot nearly empty, my stomach dropped in a slow, quiet way. I sat in my car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, realizing this wasn't about catching him in the act but about catching myself finally believing what I already knew. When he came home that night, I asked how the gym was, and he answered too smoothly, describing machines and sets like he'd memorized a script, and I nodded along, feeling something in me detach just a little more. Later, alone in the bathroom, I looked at my reflection again and for the first time I didn't look for pain or anger, I looked for clarity, because I understood then that this wasn't a sudden betrayal but a slow one, something that had been growing quietly while I was busy loving him. And the thought that scared me the most wasn't that he might still love her, it was that he might not even realize how much he was already losing me. That Thursday I couldn't sit still, my whole body felt like it was buzzing, and when he grabbed his gym bag and kissed my cheek goodbye I smiled back like nothing was wrong, then waited exactly 10 minutes before getting into my car and following the familiar route. I told myself I would turn back if I felt crazy, but I didn't, because this didn't feel like madness anymore. It felt like survival. I parked a block away and watched, telling myself I was just there to confirm a detail, just one, but when I saw him walk past the gym without even slowing down my chest tightened so hard I thought I might cry right there. He crossed the street, checked his phone, and disappeared into a small cafe I had never noticed before. Through the window I saw her before I even saw him sit down, because something in my body recognized her instantly, the way she leaned forward, the way she smiled like she already knew how the conversation would go. They hugged, not long, not dramatic, just familiar, like two people who never really stopped being close. I sat frozen in my car, hands shaking, realizing this wasn't a secret meeting fueled by lust, it was worse, it was comfort, routine, something woven into his life so neatly that I had never seen the seams. When he laughed at something she said, the same laugh he used with me, I felt a strange calm settle over me, because in that moment I finally understood the truth I had been avoiding. I wasn't watching an affair begin, I was watching a story continue, and I was the one standing outside of it. I didn't get out of the car, I didn't confront them, I just sat there watching time move in a way it never had before, slow and heavy, because once you see something you can't pretend you didn't. And I knew if I walked into that cafe I would become the crazy wife instead of the woman who finally understood what was happening to her. They talked for almost an hour, leaning in close, not touching much, but sharing that quiet language of people who already know each other's stories. And when she reached across the table and brushed his hand, he didn't pull away, he just let it happen like it was normal, like it belonged there. I realized then that the name he said in bed wasn't a mistake, it was muscle memory, something his body remembered even if his mouth wasn't supposed to. When they finally stood up to leave, he hugged her again, longer this time, and whispered something into her ear that made her smile in a way I hadn't seen him make me smile in a long time. I drove home before he did, needing the walls of my house around me, needing to sit on our couch and feel how quiet betrayal can be when it doesn't come with shouting or lipstick stains. When he walked through the door later and asked about my day, I answered honestly for the first time in weeks. I said it was long, and he nodded like that explained everything, and in that moment I understood something painful and simple. He wasn't lying because he was cruel, he was lying because he didn't know how to finish something he should have ended years ago. That night I didn't cry, which scared me more than anything else, because I had always been the kind of woman who felt everything deeply, and now it was like my emotions were standing back, watching me carefully. Lying next to him, I listened to his breathing and wondered if he felt the distance growing or if he thought I was still safely his. In the dark I replayed the beginning of our relationship, how he had told me about a woman from his past who taught him what love wasn't, and I realized now how carefully he had shaped that story, leaving out the parts that still lived inside him. The next day I did something unexpected. I searched her name online, not to stalk but to understand, and what I found made everything feel even stranger, because she wasn't some mystery woman living a secret life, she was very visible, very real, with photos, posts, and comments that showed she had never really disappeared from his world. There were pictures of places I recognized from his stories, trips he said he took alone, moments he said were just about finding himself, and suddenly the timeline of our marriage started to blur. What hurt the most wasn't seeing her face, it was seeing how openly she existed, while I had been living in a version of our relationship that only worked because I didn't ask the wrong questions. That night, as he slept beside me, I made a quiet decision, not to confront him yet, not to explode, but to let him keep choosing, because I wanted to see how far he would go when he thought I wasn't looking. The next week felt like walking on glass, every movement careful, every word measured, because I realized now that I was in a game I didn't know the rules to, and the worst part was that I loved him too much to just walk away without knowing the full story. I watched his habits, small things at first, the way he lingered over his phone, the way he sometimes laughed at messages I couldn't see, the way he got a little too quiet when I asked about his day, and each detail was like a tiny thread unraveling a fabric I had thought was strong. One evening, we had a small argument about something silly, a spilled drink, a missed appointment, but I noticed how quickly he deflected, how he avoided eye contact, and that's when I realized he had mastered this dance, avoiding suspicion, maintaining his world without me ever fully knowing the truth. Later that night I found myself scrolling through old texts, not from him, from me, and reading the conversations we had before marriage, moments of trust, laughter, hope, and it hit me hard that our story had started with honesty but was now being rewritten quietly behind closed doors. I wanted to scream, to ask, to shake him awake and demand the truth, but instead I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling like a stranger in my own life, because the person I was married to and the person lying next to me in the dark were no longer the same, and I knew that whatever came next, nothing would ever feel safe again. A few days later, I decided to take a risk, not by confronting him directly, but by planting small traps to see how he would respond, little questions here and there about work, friends, or plans that I knew would reveal cracks if he was hiding something, and I watched him carefully, noting every hesitation, every pause, every carefully crafted answer. It became exhausting, like living two lives at once, one where I smiled, kissed him, and acted normal, and another where I catalogued every move, every glance, every tiny detail for evidence that he was still emotionally elsewhere. One evening, he left his laptop open on the kitchen counter, and I couldn't resist. I didn't dive into emails this time, I just scrolled through his recent files and noticed a folder titled with that familiar name, and inside were things I couldn't unsee, notes, reminders, even a playlist they had made years ago, and it hit me like a punch to the chest that some parts of him had never left her. I closed the laptop quietly, heart hammering, hands shaking, trying to breathe without making a sound, because I understood something terrifying. This wasn't a casual memory, it was a living, breathing part of him that he carried into our marriage, and I had been pretending it didn't exist while we slept in the same bed, while I poured love into someone whose heart was split in ways I had only just begun to notice. That night, when he wrapped his arms around me, I let him, but I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling counting the seconds, imagining the conversations they might still have, imagining the closeness they still shared, and I realized that knowing didn't make it any easier, it made every night heavier, every word he said more loaded, every touch more complicated. The following week, I started noticing even more subtle patterns, little habits that made my stomach twist, like how he laughed at a text in a way that made him smile differently, or how he sometimes stared off into space, almost as if he was remembering something he couldn't share. I tried to pretend it didn't matter, tried to focus on work, friends, anything, but the shadow of that name was everywhere, lingering in the corners of my mind, whispering that I wasn't the only one who had a claim to his past. One night, I found myself going through our old photo albums, the ones from when we first met, and I realized with a shock that even in those photos, some of his stories didn't match the images. There were moments he had described as new experiences that now felt rehearsed, like he had been practicing for someone else all along. I felt anger bubble up, not the kind that makes you yell, but the cold, sharp kind that slices quietly, and I understood that this wasn't about betrayal in the traditional sense. It was about a love that had never fully moved on, a connection that existed before me and somehow survived despite our vows. Later that week, he came home tired but smiling, and I watched him carefully, noticing the ease with which he moved, the way he spoke to me with familiarity, and I realized the cruelest part. He was completely unaware of the storm I carried inside me, the knowledge that while I was here, loving him fully, he still had pieces of his heart living somewhere else, and I wondered how much longer I could exist in this half-truth before it consumed me entirely. One evening, I decided to confront reality head-on, not by questioning him directly, but by observing him in situations where his choices would reveal more than words ever could, and it was both terrifying and addictive, like I had become addicted to watching the truth unfold in slow motion. I noticed the way he hesitated before answering calls from certain contacts, the subtle changes in his tone when he mentioned names, the way he sometimes checked his phone before speaking to me, almost as if he needed to rehearse his version of honesty. I started keeping mental notes of every detail, cataloging them, connecting dots I had ignored before, and the deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. There were threads of intimacy, habit, and memory tied to that name that never really ended, never really disappeared, and it shook me to my core. That night, I stayed awake longer than him, listening to the sounds of the house, feeling his presence close but distant, and I realized that what hurt the most wasn't the absence of fidelity, it was the presence of something he carried quietly alongside me, something I wasn't allowed to touch or question. I wondered how long it had been like this, how many moments I had unknowingly shared with his past lingering in the corners of our marriage, and I felt a mix of fear and curiosity, because I needed to know just how far this invisible connection had traveled without my awareness, how deeply it had intertwined with the life I thought we were building together. By the time he finally fell asleep beside me, I had made a quiet decision to follow this thread to the end, no matter how much it hurt, because only knowing the full story would give me the power to decide what I wanted next. The following weekend, I took another step I never imagined I would. I reached out to a mutual friend who knew about his past, someone I trusted to give me a perspective without judgment, and I asked questions carefully, avoiding anything that would seem like an accusation, just trying to understand how long this connection had truly lasted and how much it still affected him. The answers I got were both subtle and devastating, little hints that painted a picture I had sensed but didn't want to fully believe. She had been around longer than I realized, their friendship had blurred lines he never fully acknowledged, and while he had moved on in some ways, in other ways he had carried her memory like a quiet companion through all the years of our marriage. I felt my stomach twist with a mixture of relief and rage, relief that I wasn't imagining things and rage that this had been happening without my knowledge, a silent presence threading its way through our life together. That night, I sat across from him at dinner, feeling the weight of this knowledge like a knife pressed against my ribs, trying to speak normally, laugh normally, act like nothing had changed, while inside, Every word he said seemed laced with invisible history I wasn't supposed to know about. I wanted to confront him, but I didn't, because I realized I needed more. I needed to see how he would behave when I knew, how he would react when the illusion of privacy was gone, and I began to feel a strange sense of power, tempered by fear, knowing that the next moves in this quiet game could change everything between us forever. A few nights later, I decided to test the boundaries in a way that felt dangerous but necessary. I started asking casual questions about his past in moments that seemed innocent, like mentioning old friends, places he had visited, or things he used to do, and I watched every flicker in his expression, every tiny hesitation, every word carefully measured before it left his mouth. It was exhausting and thrilling at the same time, like holding fire in your hands. You knew it could burn you, but you couldn't stop. I noticed how quickly he corrected himself when he mentioned certain memories, how certain details were omitted or reshaped, how he sometimes laughed a little too quickly when a topic got close to hers, and I realized that even after all this time, he still carried her with him in ways I could see but couldn't touch. That night, lying in bed beside him, I felt the weight of the past pressing down on both of us, and I couldn't sleep because every time he reached for me I imagined the invisible thread connecting him to her, like it was an extension of his body I had never been able to sever. I understood then that this wasn't about betrayal in the usual sense. It was about a history he refused to close, a part of his heart that remained stubbornly outside our marriage, and I had no choice but to navigate the space between what I knew and what he thought I didn't. By the time I finally drifted off, my mind was spinning with questions I wasn't ready to ask and scenarios I wasn't ready to face, knowing that the truth, when it came, would change everything between us. The next day, I decided to watch him more closely in everyday life, noticing the subtle things I had ignored for years, like how he smiled at certain messages on his phone, how he lingered over particular memories, and how sometimes his eyes would drift to the past even when we were doing something as simple as grocery shopping. It was maddening, but I couldn't look away, because each small detail confirmed what I had suspected for weeks: part of him still belonged to someone else. That evening, I asked him casually if he wanted to watch a movie, just a normal night in, and he agreed, settling on the couch beside me. I felt him relax, his arm brushing mine, and yet I could sense that mental distance, the quiet echo of memories that were mine only in proximity, not in ownership. Later, as he dozed for a few minutes, I noticed his phone light up, a message from a name I recognized, and my stomach clenched because I realized I couldn't escape this. It wasn't a one-time mistake or a momentary lapse, it was a living, breathing part of our life that had never truly ended. I didn't look at the message, I didn't need to. The knowledge alone was enough to make my hands tremble and my mind race, imagining the conversations, the laughter, the intimacy he had shared with someone else while I had been loving him fully. And in that quiet, heavy living room, I understood something I couldn't ignore. I wasn't just competing with a memory, I was living with a parallel life that had always existed alongside mine, and the choice to stay or leave had suddenly become unbearably complicated. A few days later, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I would confront him, but not in anger or accusation. I would confront him with observation and truth, showing him that I knew more than he realized without giving him a chance to hide behind lies. I started by bringing up things from the past in conversation, memories that I knew he couldn't explain away, small details only he and she would understand, and I watched him carefully, noting every twitch of his face, every pause in his voice, every moment of hesitation. The tension in the house became almost unbearable, like we were both walking on the edge of something sharp, knowing one wrong word could cut deep. That night, when we lay in bed, I didn't reach for him first, I let him come to me, and when he did, I noticed the difference immediately. The warmth was there, the familiarity, but the ease was gone, replaced by a subtle awareness, like he sensed I was no longer naive. I felt a strange power, tempered by fear, knowing that I could no longer pretend, that he could no longer pretend, and that the next few days would determine if the man I married could fully return to me or if I had been loving someone who had never truly let go. It was an unbearable balance, walking between love and knowledge, and I realized that the confrontation was not just about him, it was about reclaiming my place in the story that had always been his to rewrite. The next morning, I finally spoke, quietly but with intensity, asking him to tell me about her, about their past, about the threads he had carried into our marriage, and I watched as his face shifted, the easy mask falling away to reveal hesitation, guilt, and something deeper I couldn't name. He tried to answer, stumbling over words, offering reassurances that sounded practiced, and I realized then that he had never truly processed this part of his life, that he had stored it away like a secret museum, untouched, hidden, but always present. I asked more, probing gently but firmly, and slowly, painfully, he began to unravel the story, the laughter, the trips, the quiet moments that were never meant to reach me but somehow had, the unfinished emotions that had lingered for years. I listened, heart pounding, sometimes angry, sometimes shocked, sometimes aching, because what I heard explained so much yet hurt more than I imagined possible, the realization that the intimacy he had with her had never truly ended, and I had been living alongside a shadow I couldn't see until now. By the time he finished, we were both quiet, the weight of confession filling the room, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow, because the truth was out, the invisible thread had been acknowledged, and for the first time I could see clearly the choices ahead, the paths I could take, and the strength I would need to navigate what came next. That night, after hours of talking, crying, and sitting in silence together, I finally felt a sense of closure, not because the past was erased, but because the truth was out in the open and we could decide what to do with it. I realized that our marriage had been tested in ways I never imagined, and surviving it didn't mean ignoring the hurt, it meant acknowledging it, confronting it, and choosing whether love could exist alongside the shadows of memory. We didn't have all the answers, and some wounds would take time to heal, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again, like I had reclaimed a piece of myself that fear and doubt had stolen. To everyone watching this story, I want you to remember that relationships are complicated, and sometimes love means facing truths that are uncomfortable and painful, and still deciding whether the bond is worth the effort. Thank you for listening to my story. If you felt this, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, turn on the notification bell, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your opinions, your experiences, and how you would handle a situation like mine.